Hi everybody, I'm Emily. I'm one of the designers with the Quilted Cow, and today I'm going to show you how to do a bias binding. Now, the bias binding is pretty simple and it's easy to do, but it can be somewhat intimidating. So I'm going to make this as simple as possible for you today. First though, let's thank our sponsors. We're sponsored by Husqvarna Viking Machines, Creative Grids, Cutters, Mats, and Rulers, and Wilmington Prints. So let's get started. All right, so our bias binding, now this is not necessarily in a kit right now. We're not selling bias binding kits, but we do have a few things that you will want to use whenever you're doing your bias binding. One of those items is the bias ruler, and we do have this available on our website. So you can head on over there, thequiltedcow.com, head on over there and grab this. I really like using this ruler. There's another bias ruler that's a Creative Grids bias ruler. I like that one as well. It does the same exact thing as this. The other thing, if you don't have one of these bias rulers, you are going to want a ruler that's long enough to cut across your fabric whenever you're working with it. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways of doing the bias binding, of cutting your bias binding out, that in my opinion are really pretty easy, and they're the ones that I prefer to do. So what I have here is a pot holder. Now this is a new pattern. It's called Mama Marty's pot holder. We will have a video tutorial on this as well. And because it's round, it does use the bias binding all the way around. So that's the reason why you would want to use a bias binding, is if you're binding something that's round. If it's a concave or convex round, this is also bias binding in here. Anytime that you need to go around a curve of any kind, either an inside curve or an outside curve, you're going to want to use a bias binding. So the first thing that we're going to start with is a 1/2 yard of fabric. Now, I went ahead and you do want to make sure that it is cut to the 18 inches, and you're going to open it all the way up. Now, if your ruler has 45-degree lines, if your mat has 45-degree lines, you can use those. Some mats will have them going this way, some mats will have them going this way. However they work for you, then that's what you're going to use. So what I like to do is I like to start kind of next to the selvage. I find my 45-degree line, which is this one right here. I like to start with my selvage kind of right next to that. So you can use your ruler and place it on your mat. And like I said, as long as it is long enough to cut all the way across your fabric, which this one isn't quite long enough to do that, you're going to line up your ruler with this end and that end of the 45-degree line and cut along that way. So the other way to do it is that your ruler should have a 45-degree mark on it. So you should be able to set up the 45-degree line straight along the edge. Now, if you wanted to go ahead and trim off your selvage, that's fine as well. But that 45-degree line straight along the edge to get your 45-degree angle on your fabric. So that's a couple of ways to do this that you can do with your ruler or your mat, whatever works, as long as your ruler is long enough to get all the way across your fabric. Now, a 1/2 yard of fabric will get you, I think, somewhere around 280 inches of bias binding whenever you use this ruler. So it's a good number to go for. It depends on how big your project is as to like how much you're going to want to do. But I do like to cut it in 1/2 yard at a time increments. The reason for that is because that's the size of this ruler. So this ruler folds up for easy storage, and it unfolds whenever you're ready to use it. And all you do is you line up the one diagonal side and the other diagonal side with the top and bottom of your 1/2 yard of fabric. And then, because I like to go ahead and maximize the amount of fabric that I can use, I'm going to start down here where it's closest to the selvage. Now, you're still going to be able to cut these strips as well. I don't like to use where they start getting too short, just because they're just kind of small and hard to work with. But I like to at least start here and work my way all the way across my 1/2 yard of fabric, cutting as I go. So I'm gonna put these to the side. I'm gonna put this extra fabric to the side because you know you're gonna need some later. Oh, I do wanna show you, if you're cutting straight a grain, I meant to show you this, you don't get any stretch. I can't stretch this hardly at all. And that's the reason why we don't use straight of grain on round things. So there's no stretch this way, but there's gonna be stretch on that 45 degrees. All right, get that out of the way. So to sew this together, I'm gonna lay one piece this way. I'm gonna lay the other piece this way so that my lines, my little angles are gonna line up. And then if you notice, this hangs over and that's gonna be my 1/4 inch. So I'm gonna start here with this at the 1/4 inch and I'm gonna end here with the 1/4 inch. So I'm gonna go ahead and stitch this together and then I'm gonna show you how to fold and press your bias binding. So let me get this stitched together and I'll be right back. All right, so let's go ahead and get this pressed. And there's my seam and it's gonna lay, I actually usually just lay it to one side. But that gets you a nice line. There's no guessing where that 1/4 inch is supposed to start and stop, because if you didn't cut off those little points, those points would be hanging over and you would have to make sure that your 1/4 inch stopped and started where it needed to be. So I love being able to cut off those points where I need to. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna fold this just like we would any other binding. So if you've ever done a binding on a quilt, you just fold it in half, wrong sides together, and you're going to press this all the way down the strip, however long your binding strip is, once you've got it all sewn together. All right, so I now have my strip pressed in half, wrong sides together, and now it's ready to sew onto my project. Let me find, here's my pot holder. It's all ready to be bound. Now, I like to start where, and it's gonna seem a little bit strange, but if I'm gonna have a seam in my binding, if I have that seam in my binding, and I need to incorporate that into the rest of the project, then I want to make sure that the other seam where it joins is either kind of opposite where that first one was, or it's not like really, really close. So if you start down here at the end and you leave yourself your 6 inches of extra here at the end, by the time you go all the way around, basically this seam is going to be almost right next to the other seam. And I don't like to do that. I like to go ahead and separate those some. So I'll go ahead and burn a little bit of the fabric. Okay, some people would call it burning the fabric. I'll go ahead and start a little bit further in. So I'll give it almost, 10 or 12 inches in. So then whenever I finish it out, the seam that I'm joining is going to be separated from that first seam. So I just don't like to have those two seams right next to each other. You take the chance of having to join the seam to the other seam, and also it just looks a little bit weird and it adds a lot of bulk to that one area. So I go ahead and give myself a little bit of space. And there's a couple of tricks to this that you need to know. The first is, as you're adding this on, you want to make sure you're not stretching the bias while you're adding it on your machine. You want to make sure that you're just holding this and keeping it and letting the pot holder underneath turn as you're stitching, and it's just laying this binding flat on. If you start stretching it, what's going to happen is that it's going to end up stretching and you're going to get puckers and pleats on the other side, or whenever you try to fold it over, it's not going to lay over as flat. So make sure that you're just letting this attach to it without stretching the binding, and you're just turning that pot holder underneath. I want to show you, as I'm sewing this, just a little bit of how I do it to hopefully give you a little bit of an idea of how I sew this on. And I'm just holding this up and I'm allowing the pot holder to turn underneath. I pause while I'm doing it. I'm not going super fast, because you're going to want to take your time and lift your presser foot every once in a while so that you can adjust this so that it kind of folds under as it goes around, because it will, as it's going around, it will fold up a little bit. So let me go ahead and start sewing this on, and I'll show you what that looks like. I'll show you how I sew this on real quick. So I wanted to just show you a little bit of this. I have one that's already pretty much sewn on. I'll show you how to do the join in just a moment, but you'll see how it kind of it kind of bunches up underneath here. It kind of folds up a little bit underneath here, but this is not stretched out. So you want to make sure, like I said, that you're just allowing the bias binding to lay down on your project as you're sewing it down, as you're stitching it down. That way it doesn't stretch before it needs to. So let me show you. I have one that I pretty much have finished except for the join. So in order to do the join, I just want to show you, this is where I started, was over here. And so I'm just going to lay that bit of binding down, and I'm clipping it just to keep the clips, or just to keep the binding laying where it should be. I'm not stretching the binding, I'm not stretching anything out, but I want to keep it where it should be. So if you're used to binding a quilt and you know where you've got a flat edge to join the binding strips on, we don't have that here, obviously, so we need to do something a little bit different. So in order to get that kind of flat edge, what I do, like I said, is I lay down the unsewn binding. So this is not sewn down. I stop my seam right about here. There's a lot of space here that's not sewn down. So I lay it down just on top of that and use my clips to hold it where it's going to be. Now, there is a little bit of stretch to this, and that's okay. Or whenever we sew this finally on, it may stretch a little bit, and that's okay. But what I want to do is I want to just mark where these two joins are going to meet. So I have that spot right there. So I'm going to just mark here where these two meet. Now, the reason for that is because I'm going to start laying these flat in just a moment. So I have cut this end off flat, square, and that's what we need to do, is we need to have that square. But actually, let me go around. Let me mark the back side of that. So I marked both sides where that met up. And so now, instead of normally we would have our flat pieces go together, we'd fold it back, we'd fold the one side back, and then we would trim off as needed. This time, we're gonna fold back on our mark. So there's my mark on the back side, and I'm gonna lay this as flat as possible and get it on that mark. Now my binding is 2.5 inches. So I'm gonna take my ruler, and I'm gonna measure 2.5 inches in from that edge. And here's where I do something a little bit different. Because this is going to stretch as we sew it back on, I like to go ahead and shorten that just a touch, not a whole lot. Maybe about 1/16 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch tops. You don't really want to shorten it very much beyond that. But I'm going to go ahead and instead of measuring 2.5 inches, I'm going to go just shy of that 2.5 inch mark. So I'm actually at close to 2 3/8 inches. And the reason for that, like I said, is because even whenever I'm doing straight of grain binding, sometimes that's even marking that 2.5 inch mark is just too much, and I have a little bit extra at the end. So because this does have a little bit of stretch to it, I'm going to go ahead and short that just a touch. So I make my mark there, and then I'm going to cut on this line here. And I'm making sure that I'm keeping it nice and square with my ruler, making sure that my fabric is staying nice and square. And then I'm just going to cut that line off. Now, when you join your binding, if you've never joined a binding, this is how you would do it on a flat one as well. So when you're joining a binding, I always take and I open it up. So I have it laying where the fold is at the top, and then I open it up to where the right sides of the fabric are up, and they're facing each other just like this. So if it was still folded, the fold would still be at the top here. But now it's open. I'm going to take the right side, and I'm going to grab hold of the top of the right side and bring it down, and then the left side stays right side up, and I bring that down just like this. So they're going to meet up right here. Now, if you wanted to, you could draw your line, and sometimes I do draw my line sometimes. So I'm going to actually take and I'm going to draw my line here where those meet. Okay, so once you have that stitched, now, just to make sure that you have everything the way that you want it to be, take out your pins, because sometimes we can get twisted, and I have gotten twisted before on my bindings, but take out your pins, and then you're just going to pull that to where it lays flat again. And as long as you're not twisted around, as long as this is still one fold all the way across, you're good to go. So as long as you know that you're still one fold all the way across, you can go ahead now and trim this off. You can either use your ruler and your rotary cutter, or you can use a pair of scissors to trim off about a 1/4 inch seam. Now you can take this to the iron and you can press it really good if you want. Sometimes I feel like it needs that, sometimes it doesn't. And now you're ready to start stitching this down again where it goes. So once again, you're going to want to be very careful that you're not stretching this as you're going along. You can put a couple clips in just to make sure that it's going to lay where you want it to lay and that you're not going to stretch it. So that's the way it's going to lay. So now I'm going to go back. I'm going to start back to where I stopped my stitching up here. I'm going to start back a little bit, stitch over that all the way around, and then make sure that I am good to go. And I'm going to finish the stitching all the way around here. So let's go do that and join me whenever I get that done. I'll show you how to finish this binding. All right, so I now have my binding sewn onto my pot holder. And what I like to do now is I'm going to press this out first, and then y'all are going to love this because it goes so nice and neat whenever you turn it around the other way. You almost don't even need to press it down whenever you turn it over the other way. But I do like to go ahead and press it down. I always press my bindings down, even if I'm stitching by hand, or doesn't matter if I'm stitching by hand or if I'm stitching with my machine, I press my bindings down. Now you have a couple of options for finishing your binding. So if you like to hand stitch your binding, that is fine. On things like pot holders and things like placemats and stuff like that, for me personally, I go ahead and finish it on my machine. Now, I don't have matching thread on my machine, but I would do a matching thread. I would do the red thread here, which is what I did on this pot holder. I did the same red thread, and it matches really, really well so you don't see it. Now, what I do is I go ahead and I fold it over, I flip it back over to the front side, and you can put your clips on here just to hold it where you need it to be held. Make sure that it is folded over where that 1/4 inch seam is going to be, so it's covering that first seam that you laid down. And you can clip all the way around and then come back around and turn it over and stitch in the ditch, just right in that ditch. If you get too far into the pot holder as you're stitching, you're going to lose, that catching of this edge back here. Now, some people, if they're going to go ahead and machine stitch down, they like to stitch it on the back side and flip it over to the front. That is perfectly fine. And then all they do is they come back and they stitch right on top of that edge. My problem is that sometimes you miss that stitch in the ditch and you're going to see that seam on the back side. So I don't always like to see that seam on the back side. Whichever way is comfortable for you, whichever way you prefer to do it, using your machine, you do it the way you want to do it that way. If you think that you might be missing that stitch in the ditch, you're not going to stitch in the ditch on the back side and you're going to have that thread showing, use a matching bobbin thread to whatever's on the back side and a matching top thread to whatever is on whatever your color your binding is. Maybe they'll all match, maybe they won't. It just depends on what your project is. The other option is to stitch it by hand and to do a whip stitch. So once you get all that done, then your pot holder is finished, or whatever project that you are binding. So once again, your bias binding, it is necessary whenever you're working with round projects, when you're working with rounded corners, whichever way they round is good. If you're doing a quilt that needs it, then you can do that as well. I know that there are people out there that they do like to put a bias binding on everything. They only use bias binding. They don't use straight of grain binding, and that's okay too. So whichever way you prefer, whatever you want to do, quick and easy way to do your bias binding. Once again, the bias ruler, it is by TQM Products. We do have this on our website. Check that out, thequiltedcow.com. You can also find the Creative Grids bias binding ruler. That is a good one. You use your friction pins to mark with, your rotary cutters, things like that. Make sure that you have everything that you need. And I really hope that you are able to do a bias binding now. And thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to these videos so we can keep sharing some content with you. Have a great day.
Okay, you wicked cool quilters, good job. You made it to the end. We would like to thank our sponsors, Husqvarna Viking Sewing Machines, Creative Grids, rulers, rotary cutters, and mats, and Wilmington Prints for the beautiful fabrics. Thanks for watching.